Let's go ahead and shift. Let's not conflate assessments and accountability. We do this separately and turn to accountability. I would like to introduce Rebecca Holmes, who's the president and CEO for the Colorado Education Initiative. Rebecca was the associate commissioner for the Department of Education under Innovation, Choice, and Engagement in Colorado. And I just asked Rebecca to come and share with us today Colorado's recent and groundbreaking work on creating next generation accountability systems for student-centered learning. So thank you, Rebecca, for joining us today.
Sure. Thank you, Susan, for having me. It's great to be among this group of esteemed colleagues and nice to see you all. I want to highlight something Susan said, which is let's not conflate accountability and assessment. In Colorado, maybe like in many of your states, we're having a pretty tough fight right now about what we believe we should be doing on assessment. And for years at CEI, Colorado Education Initiative, we've been working with many districts and with the state agency on accountability. And what I would say to those of you who are more traditionalists when it comes to state tests, that there's plenty of room for you in this conversation. We have folks working on accountability who absolutely still believe there's a place for a high stakes state test in that model. Now, I will say too, CEI is one of the older state intermediaries in the nation. We've been an organization for 13 years with varying levels of closeness and tie to our state agency. And I've been working with my colleagues for about 7 years on reimagining accountability. It's important for you to know that I personally draw on my own experience leading a system that did quite well on our traditional measures of quality, but often did that in making some trade-offs about what we really knew would be best for young people. Now, when I have events about accountability, and in Colorado, we've now held 2 annual statewide summits on this topic, no one wants to come. Only my nerdiest friends want to come to an event on accountability. Now, we realized really that what it is a conversation about what is school quality? And then maybe more importantly, what is school quality and who gets to decide? Because we know we have a range of beliefs around what we believe actually makes up a quality school, how we should measure that, and how we should communicate that to families and to the state. So those things are kind of at the root of how we approach that work, and I like to ground people in those frameworks first. So if we'll go to the next slide, a few things I'll talk about here today. Obviously, the legislation that Susan mentioned and the local accountability pilots that we're fortunate enough to be seeing and supporting throughout the state, some emerging themes from that work. One thing that it's important to know is that we often argue with our friends in New Hampshire about who has the greatest commitment to local control, but in Colorado, we do our portrait of a graduate or graduate profile work only at the district level, although we do have some statewide expressed essential skills and dispositions. We're not a state where our governor or our commissioner could probably declare a path forward on this work. And so we're really seeing what happens when districts are allowed to lead with their communities. Next slide, please. So our belief that underlies our work in accountability over the last several years is that we want to have, to some of Paul's comments, a more balanced system, and that we argue that the current system overbalances accountability and measurement that supports high stakes reporting and undervalues approaches that would more support improvement data and continuous improvement. Increasingly, as I talk about this with folks too, it occurs to me that there should be almost a framework, like a counter that this scale sits on, which is about legitimacy and public value. A lot of our pilots began because, for various reasons, they have work in communities who don't actually believe in the legitimacy of our current accountability framework. Sometimes that's rural and the N size is too small. Sometimes that's urban, and for comments I know are emerging in the chat, it's families who believe that this is built out of an oppressive system and that has a number of what were originally unintended consequences for families and communities, but if we continue to live with them, we may need to own that those may be now intended consequences. So I want to drive home that sense of legitimacy and public value that also has to exist in this balance. We'll go to the next slide. I won't spend much time here. It's a bit of an eye chart, but it's important for you all to know that in many states, as recently as a year ago, we would get calls from states who wanted to pick up the Colorado growth measure and maybe then believe that our school accountability system is more holistic than it is. We also, like many of you, have had other groups that have turned the accountability ratings into letter grades and put those on billboards in communities. And all of our user-centered work with families then tells us that families believe that our school quality ratings are more comprehensive than they are. What you see on this chart is the reality that in elementary school and middle school, our state frameworks are 100% based on the state test with a balance between proficiency and growth. And that our high school frameworks do have an additional component there that we call post-secondary and workforce readiness measures, but that those are still pretty limited to assessment. So if you go to the next slide, we have a number of pilots, and I'll share with you shortly how those were empowered by legislation. But these are the themes that we really see in those pilots. Schools and districts who are not at all trying to get out of accountability measures, but are rethinking a system that's really only built for accountability from local to state to federal, and instead thinking about what does accountability look like when it's to your constituents, when it goes out and not just up to your families and students and community. We've begun to have legislation that supports that, as I'll share in a second. And that ultimately we're seeing that the process matters as much as the product. So folks, instead of saying there's one answer, really working at the community level to say how might we measure quality differently is building a really authentic shared experience. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see the legislation. This was Colorado Senate Bill 19204 that basically said we'll have a green light for pilots to apply to the state to then be funded to work for several years on a supplemental state accountability system. So it's never been communicated that this replaces, but the department is required in that legislation to have a learning agenda where they're pulling up the learnings from those pilots. As an intermediary, we play a critical role in that learning to sort of be a bridge between the pilots and the state agency. And ultimately, originally, these were funded, but they were funded at a fairly small level, $50,000 to $75,000 for a year worth of work. And our pilots who had been at this long before they got that money said, the money's nice, but this isn't about the money. And ultimately, this is a superintendent and their team taking on a second full job. You have to have a lot of will to do this, whether you have financial resources or not. In May of 2020, the bill still stands, but the funding was cut. And what I can report 4 months later is that every single pilot has decided to continue without the dollars, and all of the technical assistance agencies that are supporting data collection or process or community listening or dashboarding have agreed to continue as well without funds. If you go one more slide forward, you'd have to know a bit about Colorado, but what this slide tells you is that in the pilots, there's an incredible geographic and demographic range. We have small rurals going at this in a 20 district consortia. We have larger urbans, we have suburbans who've come together. Fountain Fort Carson is a military impacted district. And then down there at the bottom, emerging school and zone level projects who've said, we have an innovation policy that creates zones, who've said they want to do this whether their district it feels ready or not. So big range here. If you go one more slide forward, you'll see the common themes that are showing up in the way that folks are working on their pilots. As an intermediary, we are worried all the time that there's a lot of work that it takes to get this done, and any one pilot could kind of get squashed under its weight. So we're making sure they're learning, that those folks come together and learn together. This is what we're seeing. Some folks, to a comment in the chat from Dave Young, are really working on a diversification of measures. Others are saying, the academic measures still are primary, but we want to work on a different system that really drives school improvement. And as I said before, the process more important than the product, really building things that have legitimacy and public value, because they're not just responsive to families and community, they're really built in part with families and community, being able to determine how they see and want to wrestle with trade-offs in measurement of quality. So if we go one more slide forward, you'll see a long list of resources from the 7 years that we've been at this in Colorado, including the SCAP website, which is the longest standing pilot, and our graduation guidelines menu, which is the beginning of an effort to have high school students, I saw a bunch about this in the chat, graduate under more competency-based measures and not just seat time or testing measures. So that's it. Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Rebecca.